All right. Hello and welcome to the XX Network webinar this evening. This is the seventh in a series of 8 webinars. We're having 2 webinars on each of 4 topics, and you can see on your screen our topic for tonight is tying XX all together. And so we'll get into that. And happy holidays to everyone around the world who's celebrating holidays this week. We appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening, and we're excited again to share the XX technology with you all. This is stuff that we've been working on for a really long time, and so it's really exciting for us to share it with members of the community. So the kind of ground rules for tonight are really simple. First, we're excited to have an active exchange of views, and we welcome questions and back and forth. We ask that that be done respectfully, and that people treat everyone who's part of the webinar today with respect. Second, our focus tonight is on the technology that makes the XX network work, the Praxxis technology as well as the Elixxir technology. This is not a forum for us to discuss the XX coin sale. And so we ask that those rules be respected. And with that said, we're looking forward to a great discussion today. For those of you joining us live, there's 2 buttons at the bottom of your Zoom window. There's a chat box, and then also there's a Q&A box. And that's a great way for you to communicate with us. Our goal and agenda for this evening is to be a lot more focused on your questions. And so we'll be diving into that Q&A pretty early on. And so encourage you, if you've got a burning question, or even one of those questions that maybe you feel, you know, this is kind of the no stupid questions night, right? If you've got a question about why we're doing this, how the pieces fit together, we're excited to have that. And so let's jump to the next slide here so we can introduce the team joining you this evening. My name is Peter Somerville. I'm the head of Node and Developer Relations at Praxxis. And so anyone joining or listening in who's a Node operator or a dApp developer, I'm excited to be in touch with you. Also joining me this evening is William Carter. Will's the COO of Praxxis, really helping to build our consensus mechanism, leading the team with Praxxis in the Cayman Islands. And then Benjamin Wenger is the VP of Architecture for Elixxir. Ben leads the team of developers who have really built and launched the AlphaNet. And hopefully those of you joining us have had a chance to try that out through the XX Messenger messaging app. And so Will and Ben will be answering questions, and I'll pitch in as well here. On the next slide, let's talk about kind of our goals for this evening. And I was talking about it with Will and Ben this afternoon. The 3 of us have been really, neck deep in this stuff for a long time. And so we realize that most of you joining us have not had that same level of exposure and understanding, and thinking about the metaphor of, Ben, Will, and I have seen the completed puzzle, like a jigsaw puzzle. We know what the picture looks like when all the puzzle pieces fit together. And if we were to communicate with someone who didn't have an image of the completed puzzle, but just a pile of puzzle pieces sitting before them, how would you be able to communicate with them? And how would you say, okay, put all the blue puzzle pieces on the left, because part of the image is an ocean, and put all the green puzzle pieces on the right, because there's a, part of the puzzle is a jungle, and just talking through that. And so that's what we're aiming to do this evening, is to try to bridge the gap between those of us who've been working for a long time on building this exciting technology, talking about why we're building it, how these puzzle pieces fit together. And so to do that well, we need to be guided by your questions and really try to meet you where you are now in your understanding of, maybe you're totally bought in. This is the most exciting thing of the year for you to be part of this XX network community. Or maybe you're new to it, just ran into us on social media or something, and you're just learning about this for the first time. We're eager to answer your questions and hopefully help you understand why we're so excited about the XX technology that we and the whole team have been building this year. And so topics that we're happy to talk about, and again, that we hope that you will guide us, are what's the problem that the XX network is trying to solve? What is the vision and goals that we're pursuing? You've probably heard more about Elixxir and Praxxis than the XX network itself. And so how do those different names and teams and technologies fit together? What is kind of the high level architecture of how these various technologies connect? And then what are the milestones that our team has accomplished so far? And what does the path ahead look like? You know, when can we really get our hands on the fully implemented technology of the XX network? And so those are all topics that we're excited to talk to you about. Let me begin by addressing that first question, because I think, you know, some folks come into this and they really get the vision that we're working towards. And for others, this is more of a new thing. And so, you know, for the members of the XX network team, when we look at the world, what is it that we're trying to address? And this is something actually that David Chaum, who's our founder and CEO, has been tackling this challenge really for many years. And he's been a thought leader on the question of privacy in the digital age for decades. And so he was one of the first to really popularize the terminology of the dossier society. And so what does that mean? A dossier is a folder, a collection of information about a person. And as we've had all this wonderful digital online technology emerge and mature over the past few decades, we see that many of the world's largest companies are now built on the business model of collecting a vast amount of information about you and then selling the right to send to you extremely targeted messages. That you know, some of these large companies that I'm sure you can name, they're really in the business of collecting a really, you know, unimaginably vast dossier on you and on essentially every other human being in the world. And this really opens the door to unprecedented violations of privacy, leaks of personal information, and can facilitate the manipulation of public opinion and elections. And you know, these are not ideas that hopefully are brand new to you in 2019, but it's something that, again, David has been animated by for decades, and that members of the XX team, we see this. We're very concerned about, you know, the increasingly sophisticated manipulation of the fabric of our daily lives that some of this technology opens us up to. And this is something David last month was given an award at CWI, which is in the Netherlands. It's a kind of university where David worked throughout the 1990s. They presented him with the Dijkstra Award, which is really a top award. And so he gave a talk there, which you can find on the Praxxis YouTube page, and I'll share a link in the chat box. But David spoke movingly of this vision and how he's approached this topic over decades. And so I encourage you to check that out. But just as an example of what we're talking about, just a couple of days ago, the New York Times broke a story that this brand new messaging app called ToTok, T-O-T-O-K, and it was kind of the hot new messaging app. In fact, it's a tool of a national intelligence agency to collect information on private individuals. And so that's just the tip of the iceberg of the concerns that members of the XX network team have about what does the future look like, and are there ways to secure our digital privacy. So as we then get forward here, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Ben. But again, we're excited to have your questions. Again, at the bottom of your webinar box should be a button for both the chat box as well as a Q&A box. And we encourage you to submit your questions, and excited to have you part of this conversation this evening.
Will here. I think I'm actually going to take this section, and yeah, so we've talked a lot about the XX coin. We mentioned a little bit about, you know, what the XX coin is and what it does for our platform, why we needed to develop our own coin. We're just going to glance over this stuff briefly since we've covered it in prior webinars. And then, if you have questions on anything that we covered in the past or anything that you see here that isn't clear, we're happy to receive those questions, as Peter said, later on, or even start filling them out now as they come up. So within the XX coin, we talked about a number of different coin structures that we could potentially, or coin structures that we could potentially make and provide as payment methods within the XX network. We talked about the denominated coin structure. This is kind of the cream of the crop as far as it goes with payments on the XX network. This denominated coin structure really leverages some of the things that Elixxir's privacy technology brings to the network. So with this coin structure, you're really able to kind of have unparalleled privacy in your payments and transactions. Wallets kind of make a small trade-off between privacy in your payments. It does kind of lose a little bit of the privacy features that denominated coins have, but in turn, you get a payment method or a permanent address for your payments, so you can reuse that address. So you get a little bit more usability by kind of giving up some of that privacy. And then multi-signatures, this is a way for you to do payments that require at least two signatures or two parties to sign off on. So this gives you like multi-custodial payments. So we talked about some of these potential coin structures, why they're important, and just touched on how they work. Quantum security, we talked about why quantum security is important. And we talked about some of the hash-based signatures that enable us to provide quantum security. And we talked about why, because hash-based signatures require you to give up a private key that can't be reused, why these signatures end up being one-time use. And then finally, we talked a little bit about how we leveraged Elixxir and the XX communication side of the platform to really provide privacy to those denominated tokens. So this one's a really big one. And this one I'm expecting to have a lot of questions about. But we introduced a groundbreaking consensus mechanism. And we really believe that this is one of the first of, or it is the first of its kind to really meet the requirements that we lay out as being necessary for mainstream adoption. So this is, we went over this a couple times actually. This is finality in seconds and 10,000 plus transactions per second. This is so you can get that, that speed in the platform. And when we're talking about building the platforms, the internet platforms of the future, they need to be as fast and responsive as the platforms we currently use today, or we really can't expect them to reach mainstream adoption. We really can't expect the average consumer to really give up some of their usability. So speed is hugely important to consensus mechanisms. Second is scalability, and this is mainly applicable, or it mainly relates to the decentralization of the network. We want every user in the network to have the potential to run their own node and to really participate in the operation of the network. And so it's important that your consensus mechanism enables that, not only to really reach decentralization, but also to provide robustness, which is part of that security goal, where you have a widespread of nodes across a broad geographical area, across multiple jurisdictions and nations, so that the network is robust to attack from both within and without. And finally, quantum security. We've already gone over this a little bit, but having a quantum secure coin does nothing if your consensus mechanism isn't equally as secure. And so those are really the key requirements we set out to solve here, and we did it. We created the first consensus mechanism capable of reaching all those requirements, and we did it using these 5 key approaches. Again, we've gone over these quite a bit, but happy to really go over them again. NodeCon is a unique, first of its kind network initialization protocol. This allows us to set the network up in a quantum secure manner using very little, if no, trusted centralized infrastructure. If you want to see a little bit more about how NodeCon could be done using some kind of like physical keys, then David talked quite a bit about this in his CWI talk that Peter linked in the chat box. So I recommend everyone goes and checks that out. He did a great job laying that out. Next is committed randomness. So committed randomness, we talked about randomness being extremely important in decentralized networks, since you generally have to choose someone in the network to make the decision for a specific block or round about, which transactions are included in that block. And so committed randomness is how we do that. This is in contrast to something like proof of stake or proof of work, where you use what can become centralized resources to make decisions. And that really starts to affect the decentralization of the network. And so we have a unique way of generating randomness rather than using those selection mechanisms. And using that randomness, we do something called endorser sampling, which is core to our speed requirements and achievements. And endorser sampling is a way for us to randomly choose a subset of the network, and only that subset of the network has to receive the transactions for a particular block. So when you think about any consensus mechanism that needs to handle tens of thousands of transactions a second, that's a lot of transactions that are going to be propagated throughout the network. So it's important to reach, to build a responsive system. You want to try to keep the number of nodes that those transactions have to reach to a minimum. And we do that using endorser sampling. So we just randomly select a subset of the nodes, and those are the nodes that actually receive the transactions, they verify them and endorse them. And once those once those transactions are verified, we come to our next one, which is compact endorsement. And because post-quantum cryptography can be quite unwieldy, it's generally much larger than, say, public key cryptography, CDSA. We needed a new way to prove to the network, to prove to the clients that a block had reached finality, that the endorsers had in fact verified the transactions and that everything was correct. And so we developed this new compact endorsement method, which is basically a group signature by all the endorsers that were selected, randomly selected. And then finally, any consensus mechanism in a decentralized or even a centralized network needs to be able to efficiently recover when things go wrong. And so we laid out a couple of different fallback cases, ways that things could go wrong, and how our network really efficiently gets back on track and recovers from those disruptions. Next up.
Hey, Will.
Yeah.
So before you move on, I've kind of grabbed a couple of questions from different social media platforms today. And there were a couple around this concept of committed randomness. And so I guess kind of the first question that I've seen popping up is just what exactly is committed randomness? And so my understanding is that it's like a many-sided dice or a random number generator that's used to determine whose turn is it next, whether it's to create the next block or be one of the endorsers, or just determining who's on which mixing team.
Right.
You get part. Is that the right way to understand committed randomness, or is there more to that?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of people, when they think randomness, do think of, say, rolling a dice or picking up like a ball out of a bingo basket or something. Committed randomness is actually, I would say, significantly different than that. And it's because being in a decentralized network and having the decisions of the network needing to reach consensus among many nodes, having something like, say, a rolling dice is actually very difficult to achieve without some type of trusted infrastructure. And that's because you would need some type of deterministic algorithm that generates this random value. And generally, deterministic algorithm is going to rely on a seeded input. And so you would have to make sure that everyone agreed what that seeded input is, and then you run into the issue, well, if everyone agrees on what the seeded input is, then can that seeded input be predicted? And predictability can be a problem in randomness because if everyone knows what the random is moving into the future, it gets pretty difficult, or it becomes a lot easier to launch attacks on the network. So you can kind of see when the network will be at its most vulnerable and focus your resources on launching your attack at that point. So the way I think of committed randomness in order to kind of prevent all this stuff is committed randomness is closer to say a lottery ticket or something, where you make your own lottery tickets, or I think the way that I'm trying to think if David did this in his CWI talk, but I don't remember the exact analogy he used. But basically, you create, if you remember from the previous webinars, you create a bunch of random values, you individually as a node. So you're going to just randomly select, say, tens of thousands of random values. And you can do it any way you want. You can roll dice, you can you can consult your favorite fortune teller. We don't really care as long as you keep those values secret to yourself. And when we use a function called a hash function, which I mentioned just briefly prior, and we feed these values you generate, or you feed those values you generate into that hash function. And hash functions, just to give you a brief background, hash functions are one way. So you give it an input, it gives you an output that looks random. And it's completely unlinkable to the input without knowing, if you don't know the input. That is, if I give you the output to a hash function, you should not be able to, given a massive amount of computing power, you should not be able to figure out what that input is until I give it to you. And so we have all the nodes in the network generate a bunch of these random values, push them through hash functions, and then the outputs of this hash function are what we call committed randomness. So you share that output with the entire network. And when it's your turn, well, before I get to that, we have something called a randomness chain. It's seeded by the NodeCon random. So at NodeCon, everyone gets together, they generate a random. And that random is known to be extremely secure. And that random will choose the first block producer in the network. And that block producer will reveal one of these, thank you, actually, if you can, yeah, it's perfect. They'll reveal one of these committed randoms. They've already shared it with the network. So once they reveal this committed random, and by reveal, I mean they share the input to the hash function. Once they reveal it, anyone can verify that that was a committed random, as in it was one of the randoms that the BP shared with the entire network, because they can push it through that same hash function and make sure that it matches the commit. And if you'll see here, the NodeCon seed, like I said, selected the first BP, and the BP does a BP reveal. He reveals one of these committed randoms, and we hash both those together to generate the next random. That random, again, selects another BP. He does a BP reveal, which is hashed together and selects the next random, so on and so on. And so in this way, we don't actually rely on the network to make decisions on what the next random is. So there is no like, dice rolling algorithm where everyone needs to agree that the dice were rolled correctly, or who's in charge of rolling the dice. All we have here is a deterministic chain of hash functions where there's either two outcomes. Either the BP reveals his random to the network, in which case everything works as you see here in the chain, or the BP, say, is offline or is malicious and doesn't reveal his random, in which case we just hash the previous random. So we just pretend like there was no second input to the hash function, and we generate the next random that way. And so it's a much simpler, much more robust way, and much more decentralized and trustless way to generate randomness in the network than, say, a trusted random beacon, or using randomness from outside of the network.
Right. Thank you, Will. And so, it sounds like, one of the issues is just how do you do this really well for a decentralized, trustless system where, if you're at a casino, part of the process is that you trust the casino to come up with a pair of dice that are unloaded, that are fair, and then the casino, whatever they're called, the card shuffler rolls the dice fairly with each turn. But in something like the XX network where it's decentralized, trustless, there's no, how do you get everyone on board with that committed randomness? And so as a follow-up question to that, then, so how are other blockchains doing randomness, and are they suffering the problems that you've described here in what we're building around, or what does that look like?
That's a good question. I don't want to go too far into all the different types of randomness that other blockchains use, because frankly, there are new ones all the time. One that a lot of people know, which I've already kind of described a little bit, is proof of work and proof of stake. This is actually simply a way to fulfill the same need that randomness provides, which is you can use resources or computational resources between all the nodes to kind of host a race to solve a math problem. So that's the proof of work. And the winner of the math problem basically is the BP and gets to decide what the block's going to be. That's one way of fulfilling the requirement of randomness. Other blockchains have what are called randomness beacons. These generally use non-quantum secure cryptography to try to do the same thing we do. Obviously, because we wanted a quantum secure blockchain, this was completely out of the question for us. Other blockchains use centralized beacons like the NIST randomness, which we consider untrustworthy. I think even on their website, they say don't use this to generate cryptographic secrets. And some others talk about using, say, outside randomness, like the closing of stock markets, stock market prices, stuff like that. And really, I think at the end of the day, it's like you're relying on too much information from outside the network, and that just introduces another avenue of attack. So we try to steer clear of that.
Great, thanks. Are there more topics under consensus you talked about?
Yeah, so once we kind of, as Peter mentioned at the beginning, we have this team in the Caymans that have been really dedicated to this, researching the space and working with David to build the next generation of consensus protocol. And we've really achieved some unique properties here that are really important, specifically the first two, which is constant transaction communication complexity. This is what I mentioned with regards to limiting the number of nodes that a transaction needs to reach for consensus to be secure. So we don't need to broadcast a transaction to the entire network. This saves an immense amount of network bandwidth and also computational time verifying the quantum secure signatures on those transactions. And similarly, linear authenticator complexity. This is in contrast to a lot of networks, especially in the BFT consensus space, where in order to reach consensus, every node in the network needs to send a vote to every other node in the network. This is called quadratic authenticator complexity. And it's just simply unscalable. And this is why you see a lot of those networks generally don't have more than, say, 100 or 200 nodes in them, because it just doesn't scale past that. You took away my slide. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so this is a, go back. Yeah, so this is a great way to kind of visualize this aspect where, you know, in a small network, say one of these quadratic communication complexity blockchains out there like Cosmos, if you have a small number of nodes, you can get by with having quadratic communication complexity, because it doesn't seem that infeasible next to linear or even constant communication complexity. But, you know, for robustness and for decentralization, you obviously want many more nodes than 100. And that's where quadratic becomes a huge issue. And you can see that here with even just jumping from 3 to 7 nodes in the network. Communication complexity has, you know, it's gone up by a square. So you can imagine what this looks like with 1,000 nodes. Thanks. There we go. Egalitarian consensus. This is another unique and extremely important property we have, and it ties into the proof of work and proof of stake aspects of randomness that I mentioned earlier, and really the pitfall that those get you into, which is these networks are trying to be decentralized, but then their choices are being made based on the centralization of resources. So the centralization of, say, computing power in proof of work, or the centralization of wealth in proof of stake. And you know, if you're able to centralize power or stake enough, then you have significantly more power in the network. And our network is not like that. We're egalitarian in nature, so all the nodes in the network have the same amount of power as every other node in the network. And we think that's extremely important to the robustness of the network, but also towards, you know, decentralization and making sure that the network stays safe from centralized concentrations of power. Unmanipulatable randomness. I've talked about this a bit, about how we achieved it, and also about why it's important, because this allows us to prevent us from using, this allows us to avoid using proof of work and proof of stake type of algorithms, which gives us our probabilistically unpredictable scheduling, which again, this allows us to do our endorsement sampling and prevent malicious actors, both within and without, you know, outside the network, to launch attacks on the network based on the scheduling of these nodes. And then finally, compact quantum secure proof of finality. This is important so that we can really enable users and clients to use this network, especially on mobile devices where bandwidth can be quite limited because you're on data plans, for example, or, you know, because the processing power of a phone might be, you know, significantly less than running a node. So this gives you a way to check that a transaction is final, even on a smartphone, in a very data efficient manner. And that should cover everything, but I'm happy to answer any further questions you guys have on this.
Great. Thanks, Will. And again, folks on the webinar, please ask further questions and we can loop back into this topic. I've seen a couple of questions around node operations. And so I think let's talk a little bit about nodes. And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. and I think Ben can also contribute to that conversation. And so first, here on this webinar, one of the attendees, Jericho, is asking, at mainnet, can anyone who wants to run a node do as they please, or will they still be screened? And so I can answer a little bit of this, and Ben can probably fill in a little bit. And the question here, so the answer is that there will be a process to get on board as a node. It's going to be a decision that's ultimately decided by the governance process once we're up through that mainnet. And the kind of reasoning for that is, as Will has described, there's a lot that goes into being a node within the system, being predictable with your uptime in terms of getting looped into this randomness of finding when it's going to be your turn to be a block producer, when it's going to be your turn to be one of the endorsers, getting a node assigned into the mixing teams for that CMix, you know, the kind of Elixxir technology that shreds the metadata. And so, you know, for example, a lot of proof of work systems, it's pretty, anyone can just march up and start working, you know, with Bitcoin as an example. The kind of deciding mechanism is being the first node, or miner is the terminology they use more to solve that hash function. And so anyone is welcome to kind of jump in there and start attacking that hash function. In reality, you need, you know, a whole server farm of supercomputers to have much of a chance of winning these days. And so with the XX network, we've taken, as we'll describe, a more egalitarian approach. Ben can get into kind of the hardware requirements for a node, but they're intended to be consumer grade, something that should be accessible for folks all around the world of a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds. And so that means that we need to have more of a process for someone to get accepted into that node community. And so, Ben, are there other pieces of that to add?
Yeah, so I can add a little more detail as to why we're using such a selection process beyond just the governance questions. Nodes within the XX network have to run CMix, and CMix has a really interesting and odd privacy property where a group of nodes together process messages, and if a single and one of them is honest, it's impossible to break the privacy. But if all of them are dishonest, then it is possible to break that privacy. So if we imagine that someone controls half the network, and there's 8 nodes, which is what we think will likely be in an individual team, it would be possible for someone to 1 out of 256 of the time break that privacy. Now that isn't very much, it's not something we're worried about, but it does mean that we're a little bit more concerned than other networks might be of large ownership. So that is another impetus for us to have this public vetting process. And I want to just make it very clear that we're not talking about a foundation or a group of people or a secret cabal or a committee deciding who could be a node or not. It'll literally come up for a vote the same way any code change will come up for the vote, although there likely will be some accelerations to the process simply to make it have higher turnover. But yeah, I think that in general, Peter, you covered it.
Great, thanks, Ben. And so there's another question actually from Discord this afternoon, just kind of in general asking about what are the requirements for running a node. And so, you know, there's, again, just, you know, the actual computer requirements. Way back in January, and I'll post a link in the chat box, we came out, yeah, and great, Ben's got a slide for me here, describing the node specifications. And, you know, this is not the final specifications for the beta net, but this is what we put up on our website in January, and it's stayed the same since then. And we expect that the beta net node requirements will be pretty similar. And we also expect that the mainnet requirements will be similar. If, like, our goal is to make our code as sophisticated as possible so that the hardware can be therefore as reasonable as possible. But this is something that we hope and expect that node operators can either have the hardware, the physical server present where they are, or can look to cloud providers to provide this. But again, we want to avoid a scenario where there's 3 huge consortiums next to hydroelectric dams running the whole network, or also a situation where only a couple of cloud service providers end up sort of controlling or at least running all of the nodes in the system. That those are both kind of scenarios of concentration that we're seeking to avoid. And so that's the hardware aspect of that. In terms of the more less tangible things, for the beta net, which again we expect will be turning on early in 2020, certainly in the first half of the year. We had a beta net node selection process that ran kind of for the first half of 2019, where we were hoping to find about 100 really good folks. We ended up with just hundreds and hundreds of really exciting applications. We had 870, I think, from like 80 or 85 countries around the world. And so we selected 600 node operators to be part of that beta net. We will early in 2020 be getting in touch with them with the timeline for getting that live. That's another topic that we're happy to get into more detail with you all here. And so for that process, what were the requirements to be a node operator? Well, first we went to the community and said, please take the survey and tell us what you think is important. And then we turned around and based on those responses, had an application for those beta net nodes, basically asking those most popular questions. So kind of a fair amount about what are your specifications, what kind of bandwidth do you expect to be able to maintain from where you are, and also some kind of philosophical questions. What draws you to the XX network? What makes you passionate about privacy, decentralization, the kind of speed, scalability, security, the issues that kind of animate our work here at the XX network. And so for the mainnet, so that was the process for the beta net, and they'll be going to work early next year. And then probably by late 2020, we'll be creating the mainnet. And for that, right now, that's wide open for node operators, both those currently running nodes and folks who are interested and passionate about, again, these issues that we're animated by, to get involved in running a node on the mainnet. And again, this is a process that's going to be driven by the community of the XX network. And so we ultimately expect, 1,000 to thousands of nodes on that mainnet. And it's very much our goal for that to be a decentralized, widespread, worldwide community. And we're excited to see that community develop. And so again, Ben, I don't know if you have more insight to add to that question, but that's how I would answer that one.
Not at this time.
Okay, great. And so there's one more question coming from David here on this webinar asking, and I'm not sure that his terminology would line up with how we're talking about it. And so this is probably a question more specifically for Ben. But David asks, so not all nodes are mining nodes. And so might the reason to have a non-mining node be to avoid needing a wallet? And question of whether having a wallet means that you lose some privacy, since requests can be sent to a node via code. And so, Ben, do you have an insight into how to respond to that?
In general, I do not believe that there'll be a necessity for any nodes to have wallets in order to function. It's not currently planned, although things could change. This kind of gives you some idea of the operations that nodes will operate. So the idea is that nodes will always be operating in some capacity. So when I say a team only operates for a short period of time, that is their real time. So the way that this network operates, maybe go to a different slide so I can explain that in better detail, is that you have these teams, and what happens is that a team is formed, and then the team spends a long time pre-computing. So in these diagrams here, the long P, that's their pre-computation, and then the R is the real time where they actually process messages. And so when we go back to, so what's going to end up happening is that from the CMIX perspective, nodes are the majority of the time doing something for CMIX, but only a small portion of the time actually processing messages. And this is actually kind of one of our core technologies, which is that we're able to do all of this math before a message is actually received, which allows us to process substantially more messages and to mix them under significantly higher anonymity sets, giving users far better privacy. So what this ultimately means is that you know, nodes will most of the time be pre-computing, but that doesn't mean it will be a small minority of the time processing their messages. But that doesn't mean they won't, for a large majority of the time, be doing work for CMIX. The other component of this slide, I'm going to get into it even though it's not part of the question, is that due to the specific resource allocations that the Elixxir CMIX requires and the consensus operations require, they can operate simultaneously and asynchronously on the same node without conflicting. So during pre-computation, the primary resource used by CMIX is the GPUs, and they've got little network usage, which allows consensus to take up the majority of CPU usage and to take up network usage. And then while they're doing CMIX processing, they don't work on consensus. But that's a very, very small minority of their time. So, you know, so the question of how often are you selected does not connect to how much you're utilized. We expect utilization to be very high on the CPU and GPU side, and on network, I think that it will be significant, although I don't think that, like this diagram suggests, it'll be at 100% capacity.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ben. And so the basic idea here is that most of the nodes who are part of this network are going to be doing work just about all the time. The questioner was also asking about, you know, his terminology was mining nodes. And I know that's not really technology we use in-house, but you understand the thrust of that question?
Yeah, so the term mining is what's often used for the process of computation in networks, and specifically generally applies to proof of work blockchain networks. So our network is not proof of work, so we don't do this large amount of computation to select a block producer. We use the committed randomness, as Will described. So our view is that our nodes don't really do mining, but they do in general operate at a large scale and do a heavy amount of operations. But all of that work goes directly towards providing security or processing blocks and et cetera. It's not part of a computationally intensive selective process. In general, we say we don't have mining. The term mining is generally used somewhat loosely, and the definition I proposed here is narrower than other people would use. That's somewhat the nature of this industry. It's still young, and terms are still evolving, and there isn't general consensus on what they mean.
Right. Great. Thanks, Ben. And I've got another question about nodes. And I think this came from one of the social media platforms today, and just asking about, you know, how are we going to make sure that both for the beta net and the main net, that there are enough nodes to run the network? And so I can certainly answer that question for the beta net. And, you know, again, we were hoping, can we find 100 really good node operators through that selection process there in the first half of the year? And we ended up with just hundreds and hundreds of high quality applications. And so we chose 600 node operators, you know, and we'll be delighted, and we'll have good quality work for all 600 of them to be doing, if all 600 of them come through and do a great job throughout the beta net. But there's also some redundancy built into that. And so, you know, the current AlphaNet that's running, there's 8 nodes who are part of the AlphaNet, 5 of whom who are active at a time. And that's, they're not even getting into that kind of taking turns with the mixnet pre-computation to real-time process that Ben described. We're expecting and looking forward to seeing that implemented with the BetaNet. And so, yeah, fundamentally for the BetaNet, again, hopefully we'll have all 600 node operators doing a great job, but there's a lot of redundancy. And so if folks aren't all able to be part throughout, we'll have room for that. With the mainnet, and this is the sort of thing that gets into token economics and governance a little bit, and so I won't go too far afield unless folks here on this webinar have interest in getting into that. That's one of the questions that we really addressed in the previous webinar, focusing on token economics and governance, where there's sort of a balance where we want, as we've described, we want nodes to be active, engaged, have really high uptime, because we want them to be involved in the network all the time. That takes certainly costs and also some time and energy on the part of the node operators. And so we need to make sure that that's in their financial self-interest to do so. And so there's a structure around the token economics where there's going to be some fees collected, which will be paid out to these node operators. If we see a lot of folks jumping off, then again, as a decentralized network, through that governance process, there may be a conversation about maybe we need to increase the fees that are made available to these node operators, or if vice versa, maybe we can turn down those fees a little bit. But for the mainnet, the short answer there is that we hope that the network, through that governance decentralized process, will use those kind of economic tools to make it attractive for node operators to be part of the mainnet. And so, Ben, not sure if you have something to add to that one, but that's, at least for the mainnet, my thinking on that.
So I think our view on is that nodes need to be incentivized by the operation of the network. I don't think we're interested in like inorganic growth or centralized growth, meaning we're not interested in having a foundation directly pay the nodes, because that means the foundation could have control over them. And we're not interested in a network which supports itself primarily through just inflation. We, both philosophically and from kind of more mechanical perspective, we strongly believe that for a blockchain network to take off and really become something significant, it has to derive the incentive from its organic operation, which is core to how we've designed our economics. So by building off the scaling properties of the messaging, by building off of the really, really fantastic throughput that XX consensus offers us, we really think we're going to be able to push organic and real utilization of the network, which will create fees, which will ultimately end up with really, really strong incentivization for nodes to join. And this is part of why the first thing we've released to the network hasn't been a BetaNet and hasn't been what we see from many other groups, which is a wallet. The first thing that we've released has been the messenger, because building up that utility and gaining the experience to be able to build apps and build services that really use the utility of the network is going to be the catalyst for the network's growth and the catalyst for how nodes will make money and therefore are incentivized to operate. So I think that for mainnet, we've set ourselves a buffer of a few years where the network is designed to support just through inflation, because it'll take some time for it to grow. But eventually, we strongly believe that the network has to support itself through its core utilities. Otherwise, it's kind of just treading water, and it's kind of just pretending.
Thanks, Ben. So one more kind of question about nodes here, and then there's a number of questions about coins that I want to kind of point us towards here soon. But Keith here is asking about what's the process or processes for nodes to be rewarded during one specific round or over the course of many rounds.
So
Oh, go ahead, Ben.
we haven't put out this specific mechanism by which they'll be rewarded, and I think that'll come out over time. But at least in my view, the specific mechanism is less important in our network due to the egalitarian selection. Over a relatively short period of time, all nodes will probabilistically be selected to do every job. And it's due to the fast pace of the network, it's going to take just a number of days for everything to even out. So in general, our view is that the specific event at which that occurs doesn't matter as long as it follows that egalitarian pattern, because you're not going to have some nodes doing more of one thing and some nodes doing more of the other. Everyone's going to do every job.
Great. Thanks, Ben.
Will, do you have more to add to that?
Yeah.
No, I think that's a very, very good response. Identifying the particular process, say producing the block or being the endorser or being in a CMIX team, is just not something we've really sat down and concretely made a decision on. We can go a lot of different ways, and we think that it's, we want to kind of play it all out and study the problem before we make a commitment to any particular process. But I mean, Ben answered it perfectly. Because of the egalitarian nature of the network and the fact that you're going to be doing every job multiple times a day or even multiple times an hour, it really shouldn't matter. The amount of incentive or reward you get should be the same.
All right, great. Thank you, Will. So we've got a couple of questions about coins, and first a couple asking specifically about denominated coins. And so first here from Jericho, asking about denominated coins. Are there other companies or blockchains that have focused on denominated coins and developed them, or is it something that's proprietary to the XX network?
Yeah, this is Will. I'd love to answer this one. This is actually closely linked to another question that Byron answered, which I'll try to answer both in the same breath because they really have a lot to do with each other. So denominated coins, we are not, the XX network itself is not the first to use denominated coins. I mean, denominated currency has been around forever, but I think even the first denominated digital currency, David will have to forgive me if I misrepresent it, but was DigiCash back in the 90s, which was the first digital currency and also the one David invented. That I think, or I believe, was actually denominated as well. As far as current digital currencies, Monero used to be denominated, and they were denominated because they use what are called ring signatures. And they were denominated for a slightly different reason. And one of the reasons why they moved away from denominated, or the denominated coin structure, has to do with these ring signatures, and we don't suffer from the same thing. And so we think they're here to stay for us. I'll go into a little bit about what a ring signature. No, I guess I won't describe what a ring signature is, but the way these were used in Monero was you would break up transactions into denominated sub-transactions, similar to what we do. And then the ring signature would look for same denomination sub-transactions to create the ring signature structure with. They moved to a new structure called ring CT, which meant that they didn't need to do this to provide the same privacy properties that they were providing. But the denominated structure they were using suffered from this idea that in order for your transaction to actually be private, within the same batch or the same block, you needed to find at least one or two other denominated sub-transactions of the same denomination. Otherwise, there wasn't enough there to really hide who the transaction was from and what the value was. Our sub-transactions and our denominations work in a slightly different way, and the privacy properties tie into this next question from Byron, which is, can you explain the privacy trade-off between wallets and denominated coins in some detail? So the reason we do denominations and the reason why they provide privacy, Ben wrote a pretty good blog article or a blog post about this not too long ago, where he compared, or he used the analogy of buying a latte, I believe, where he said that there are transactions out there that are highly identifiable because, you know, they're repeated. So maybe you go to a coffee shop and you buy your favorite drink every morning at the same time. The value of that, you know, if you know nothing else about what that payment was for, say you have some form of encryption, so you can't see who the payment is going to, you can still gain a lot of information just by knowing what the value, the very specific value of a transaction is. So say you know how much someone is paid, then you, and you had this same kind of semi-private network where the recipient and the recipient and the sender were encrypted, you could still try to identify it just based off of, you know, knowing how much a certain person is paid. So what we're trying to do here is break down those very specific identifiable values, the value of a transaction, into unidentifiable sub-transactions, these denominated values. And that's why we chose denominated tokens here. It's because it forces you, and this is why we chose binary denominations, is because it forces you to break transactions down into a flat distribution of uniform sub-transactions. And so by having this uniform spread of sub-transactions, even a highly specific, if you look at this diagram, even a highly specific value when broken down into, say, 2 to 10 coins, when mixed with all the other transactions in the network, when it gets out the other side, it's going to be very hard to piece together, because you don't know which of these coins corresponds to any of the other coins. You don't know who sent the 2 coins, who sent the 1 coins, who sent the 4 coins. It's going to be hard to piece together very specific values, say a 3. Because maybe somebody didn't send a 3, maybe someone sent a 4, say the 2 coins were linked and the 1 and the 4 coin were linked. You would have had someone sending a 4 transaction and a 5 transaction, when in reality someone sent a 3 transaction and a 6 transaction. So using this denominated approach, we can hide the values of these transactions. So this goes into, okay, what is the privacy? I talked about a privacy trade-off between a wallet and denominated coin. A wallet, by its nature, is kind of like a checkbook, right? So you write down, or you sign a transaction of a very specific value and you send it to the network. We can still provide privacy in our system for these transactions. Number one, nobody knows who's sending the transaction because of the metadata shredding, but we can also limit the problem I mentioned earlier, where you can identify transactions based on specific values by, say, splitting those, the client can split that wallet transaction into 3 wallet transactions, for example, of, you know, random portions each. So instead of, say, a $15.19 wallet transaction, it would be broken up into 3 sub-transactions that are randomly valued, but when added up would be the same total. And by mixing those all in with other wallet transactions of the same type, you do get a little bit more privacy, and possibly even significant privacy, but it will generally be lower than if you had just chosen to use purely denominated tokens. So that's kind of the privacy trade-off we're talking about, is generally you have maybe a smaller mixing set, because, you know, perhaps most of the network is using these denominated tokens, and really you're only providing privacy within other wallet transactions. And you're not breaking the sub-transactions down into uniform values, which is what the denominated tokens get you. So that's kind of the privacy trade-off. You're still getting a little bit of privacy. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Ben.
No, I think you covered it pretty well. You know, privacy isn't a binary thing. It's actually very complicated. A really detailed view of how privacy works and what different privacy options that exist are would find differences between the different offerings available between Monero, the XX network, Zcash, and other options that exist. And the differences are quite minute. And you know, this interdifference between wallets and denominated coins is just one example of differences in privacy. And it doesn't mean that they're, you know, completely not private. So, you know, it's an area that I think that as time goes on, we're going to find significant more research on and be able to describe it in better manners. But I think that, you know, it's still kind of early to figure out how we really describe and understand privacy.
Thanks, Ben. And, you know, that might be a good transition to this question from David L. And I'll best let you kind of characterize this question and find what's the best answer here.
Yeah, so David, you're asking about if running a node gives you more secure transactions, which is pretty often the case in many networks. And it's an interesting question. So any transaction, any block isn't processed by all nodes on the network. So if you take the position that those nodes that process a transaction give, if you're in that node, you give more security in the processing of the transaction, you're already applying randomness to that. That being said, in general, the cryptographic issue that I believe this is generally referring to is knowing the origin of the blockchain, meaning you generally have to hash all the way back towards the beginning of time to be 100% certain that you're on the correct blockchain. And there's different mechanisms to handle that, different loopback mechanisms. And we've not talked about how we're going to approach that, but I don't think that we're going, but our plan isn't necessarily make it so that everyone has to run a full node to have absolute certainty. That being said, in general, our goal is not to make it so that the security is dependent upon running a node, but also if one wants to know the entire history of the blockchain, one could certainly do so without running a node on the network. So running a node on the network involves having enough processing power, enough RAM, and enough GPU power to be able to do all of the mixing and all the consensus operations. But if one simply wanted to be able to keep a full list of the entire operations of the network, one could do so with substantially less power, substantially less bandwidth, because one just needs to have the final signed blocks that were produced by the network. So there's more to come on this, but I don't think that running a full node on the network is going to be required for absolute maximum security guarantees. Even if one believes that you want to have the full blockchain identified, one could do so in a significantly cheaper manner, which doesn't require running a complete node. I hope that answers your question. I hope I fully understand it. And feel free to clarify if I didn't get what you're going for.
Great. Thank you, Ben. And so there's a question here about governance, and asking the question, once we launch the mainnet here, is there a risk that XX governance will apply higher inflation than what the creators are intending?
I mean, yes, although I don't consider that a risk. What I mean by that is the inflation that is designated because we believe the network will really gain usage. And under that scenario, having more inflation than what we've proposed it just becomes redundant. You end up paying the nodes more than higher and higher amounts, and inflation always comes with a cost, because the higher your inflation, the more you're disincentivizing investment, and the more you're incentivizing getting rid of your coins, which reduces their value. Which is why we've targeted low inflation, because we believe the network really will achieve broad usage. In the event that doesn't happen, generally the best approach to the network would be to have a to increase inflation. So I think that, our view on inflation is that, we've given what we really hope the network turns out to be, but the network doesn't fail if if inflation goes down or inflation goes up. Like, we expect this to be an organic and honest process. So I hope that answers your question. We recognize this is very different than what other networks do. Most networks give you this kind of set inflation pool. It's very important that the number of coins are capped. We're taking a different approach. If you really dig into this, there's a core economic tension and different approaches to how to view economics in this area of economics. And, we're coming from a different perspective.
Yeah, and we've got a lot deeper into governance in the previous webinar here, and you can find the video of those previous webinars on YouTube, on the Praxxis account on YouTube. But as we mentioned in that webinar, questions of token economics, questions of governance, oftentimes are less focused on getting computer servers to cooperate with each other, but actually getting human beings to cooperate well with each other. And so these are the sort of things where members of our team have spent decades thinking about how to run governance in this sort of a decentralized system. But this is also something where if you spot or foresee concerns that we need to take account of, that's something that we really welcome that feedback, both now and as we continue to build the XX network. And so we've launched a poll, by the way. Next Monday is scheduled to be the 8th and final webinar in this sequence. And if there's specific topics that you'd like to see us address on Monday, we're eager to get that feedback. And so, all right, there's a couple of questions here. First, I'm going to point a question to Will. And David is asking, is the digital bearer instrument functionality accessible in the developer SDK? Does it live in the Praxxis layer or the Elixxir layer?
Yeah, so the digital bearer instrument, I'm assuming he's referring to the denominated coin, which we many times refer to as a digital bearer instrument. Any coin related or blockchain or consensus related functionality will live in the Praxxis layer. The Elixxir layer will be primarily for the mixnet portion of things. So is it available in the developer SDK? Not at the moment. I'm actually gonna turn it over to Ben, though I would guess that we are not yet ready to announce when that functionality would be available.
We don't have an announcement date for when that will be available. This stuff is always in flux, so often it'll be capable for us to put a beta version, alpha version out earlier if there's high demand. So I don't want to discourage people if this is really important to something that they want to see immediately from letting us know that, because we definitely are capable of kind of changing up our priorities based upon what the community needs most.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Ben. And there's another question that I think I'm going to point your way from David here, asking, in the future, might there be a node variant that's akin to what in Bitcoin is known as an SPV node?
So what I was describing before, in some ways, is the opposite of an SPV node, which is somewhat interesting. I can't say no. I'm not a mind reader. I can't tell the future, but currently, I don't think we've discussed that functionality. What I think we'll likely see is a lightweight node-like entity that someone can run to monitor the network, to validate that it's operating appropriately, which would require significantly less performance than the nodes themselves. That being said, we don't have confirmed plans for this at this time.
Great, thank you, Ben. As I just mentioned, the chat box, we've got time to take a couple more questions before we wrap things up tonight. And so if you do have a question, please use the chat box or the Q&A box. I see a hand raised. Someone by the name of Charles has raised their hand, and let's try an experiment here where I'm going to turn on Charles's microphone. I don't know Charles. I don't know who Charles is. If you have a microphone, you can ask your question, or else we can try to communicate by chat. So I'm turning your microphone on. Okay, I'm not sure that the unmuting is working, but I see him texting. And so I'll pose this to Ben and Will here, asking, the question is, are you hoping to work with MAI safe? So Ben or Will, I'm sorry, MAID safe, MAID safe.
I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with this project. I just looked them up and they certainly look interesting. So, we definitely are interested in general of integrations and working with other projects, especially as we become more mature. We're not of the opinion that the decentralized world is, lonely, in that it's a one-size-fits-all approach. So we'll look into it and we'll tell you our thoughts of the project and what we could see as potential integrations. But as of right now, I don't know enough about them to comment. I don't know if Will does.
No, I don't. Same as you. I just looked them up, and they do look like an interesting little project. But I would echo Ben in saying that we will look into them before providing a more detailed answer.
All right. Yeah, thanks, guys. One more question from David here, asking, he has the impression that one could use a DBI to wrap a coin from another blockchain. Is that something that's part of the package here for the XX network?
I'm not sure where you got that impression, David, but it is a very astute observation. Technologically, yes, you could wrap a coin from another blockchain. We have not announced plans to do that. And so I'm going to leave it at that and saying that it is possible with our technology, but it's not something we've announced at this time.
All right, thank you, Will. So I'm going to start to kind of wrap things up for this evening. We have one more webinar coming up on Monday, and that's going to be at the 2 p.m. GMT time. So it's a morning webinar for those on the Western Hemisphere, and then an afternoon or an evening webinar for those in the Eastern Hemisphere. I've been kind of running a poll here. We're eager to be service to you, the community, in sharing with you the XX network and this technology. It's work that we're really excited about. And again, part of our vision is we've got the world's best technology and only 5 people in the world can understand it, that's not really a decentralized network. And so our goal is not just to have great technology, but also to share and to spread great understanding of it, because that's going to drive the growth of this community, user adoption, and get the kind of virtuous circle that Ben's described so well. And so we're just really excited to be bringing these ideas to bear. Monday's webinar will be the last in this series, but certainly not the last that you'll hear from us. You can always communicate with us by a variety of social media platforms. We're especially active on Telegram and Discord, and you can find links to those on the Elixxir and Praxxis websites. And so I'm going to kind of hand the microphone to Ben and Will for any kind of closing comments. But yeah, it's so exciting to see. Here we are almost an hour and a half in, and like 100% of folks who've tuned in are still here. That's something that really is exciting and an honor for me to be part of. And so, Ben, do you have any kind of wrapping up thoughts here?
Yeah, these always go by so quickly. And it's the kind of thing where we could talk about for hours and hours. And I guess we're going to have a long time to discuss this with you guys. But, as we said over and over again, blockchain isn't kind of it's inherently kind of a communal activity, and getting feedback and getting perspective and educating those on what our plans are and then changing them based upon community input is a critical component of this process. So thank you for asking questions, thank you for participating, and we hope you'll continue to do so.
Yeah, and following up on that, I again want to thank everyone who's asking, following us, number one, but, spending your evenings and mornings sitting through these webinars, learning more about the platform and asking really insightful questions. I would ask that, you continue to think of great questions to ask and share them across our different platforms. But also I'd ask you guys to maybe think about some additional content that you guys would like from us, whether it's in the form of webinars or recorded video, because I think this is proven to be an effective way to really interact with you guys, the community. And so we'd like to continue doing that. And so we'd like to hear your thoughts on what topics you'd like to hear more about. And yeah, thank you for joining us.
Yes, yeah. Once again, we're honored to have you join us here during the holiday season. And again, this idea that we're acutely aware of, that, we're so deep into this topic that we realize it's a challenge to just really clearly explain it to folks who are newer to these concepts. And so we especially appreciate your help in just hearing from you. What are the topics that you want to hear expanded upon? What are the issues that you have questions about? And so it's been really fun through these webinars to see these kind of questions bubble up, and we look forward to that continuing. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We have one more webinar coming up on Monday, which we hope you'll join us for and spread the word with your friends and connections as we continue to spread and grow the community around the XX network. And so for tonight, thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Have a great evening.